Hey y'all, it's Lollie. I'm back. You're back. We're all back for another fashion designer deep dive. And if you don't know who I am, my name is Lollie. I make videos about fashion designers. So if you love fashion, talking about fashion designers, then this is the place for you. And you are in for a special one because this is my next series and I've been talking about it for a while and it's finally happening. We're going to be talking about my favorite fashion designer of all time. So that's really exciting. It is the holiday season, and with everything going on in the world, nothing feels all that special or celebratory right now. I know I've been feeling it, and honestly, that's probably why it's taken me so long to make these videos, but I'm just one person, and I'm literally trying to do my best. Hopefully y'all are doing okay too. But like I said, today we are going to be talking about my favorite fashion designer, so get comfy, grab a blanket, your favorite snacks, and settle in because you are in for a ride. This fashion designer is so near and dear to my heart. They were odd and strange, they rubbed people the wrong way, but they were honest and authentic, a natural-born talent who literally turned fashion into art. And if you couldn't tell by the title, today and probably for the next 2 months or so, we are going to be talking about the one and only Lee McQueen, or as he was famously known, Alexander McQueen. The same person. Or are they? That is a question that I want us to keep in the front of our heads as we move through his story. And before we literally go anywhere else, I do want to give a brief warning. Maybe you know Alexander McQueen's story, maybe you don't. That's totally fine. That's what these videos are for. His story is incredibly tragic. We are going to be not going in full detail, but we will be discussing suicidal tendencies, drug use, depression, sexual abuse, body dysmorphia, among other things. And there are triggers everywhere. So if you aren't in the right headspace for that, it's literally no pressure. It is totally okay to leave right now. It's okay not to be okay, and it's okay to come back to these videos when you're feeling better. They will be here for you. I absolutely promise that. Alexander McQueen is remembered as one of the most iconic fashion designers of the 21st century. He had an entire exhibit dedicated to him at the Met Gala in 2011 and won Designer of the Year 4 times. But when he started out, the fashion world turned their noses up at the East Ender, calling him names like l'enfant terrible and the hooligan of English fashion. But the problem was that they didn't know Lee. They didn't know the anger, the despair, the corruption, the guilt, and the fragmentation that was deeply rooted inside of him that was being purged in his work. The bruised and battered models sent down his runways carried traces of him, and each collection visited moments in his life that had an impact on him. He took the ugly moments of his life and churned out a thing of beauty. Andrew Bolton, curator for the Met, said McQueen sewed anger into his clothes, and he quite literally did. But it would take almost a decade and loads of negative reviews for people to see the true contribution his work had on the world of fashion. He was unlike anyone before him, with his subverted tailoring techniques and theatrics, which further transcended him. Many said you could trace harbingers of death and destruction through his collections. The reason his work resonates with so many is because of the visible self-destruction. It was like watching someone fall in love in real time, but also watching someone fall apart in real time.
I really worked that East End job, this juxtaposition between an hooligan and someone who uses a needle, and people couldn't fathom it. And so it was new, it was a breath of fresh air.
His work showed the ups and downs of his life. He wanted people to know that there is blood beneath every layer of skin.
Every fashion designer wants to create an illusion, create things that disturb, fascinate people. Clothes are really beautiful to work with, but there's also a reality outside. Some people don't want to hear it. It's all lovey-dovey and everything's fine in the world all the time. And I tell it the way it is.
Lee once said, "There is no way back for me now. I'm going to take you on journeys you've never dreamed were possible." And that is exactly what's happening here today. I'm going to take you on a journey. The journey of Lee Alexander McQueen.
I didn't care about what people thought of me. I didn't care what I thought of myself. So I would go into the fold of my dark side and pull these horrors out of my soul and put them on the catwalk.
And I know I usually say that we have to start at the beginning and like the very beginning, but today I need to take us like way back to the McQueen family origins, or what is believed to be the McQueen family origins. Lee's mother, Joyce McQueen, spent her life trying to trace the family's genealogy, and she long suspected the family descended from the Isle of Skye. Now, growing up, Lee became obsessed with these stories and watched her unroll an 8-foot-long scroll decorated with an elaborate McQueen coat of arms, pointing out names of long-dead ancestors and their past. He grew up fascinated by the island's Gothic history and his ancestral home. obsessing over the gory, brutal tales of Scotland and how his ancestors suffered and endured under the hands of the English. He learned Clan McQueen were probably of Norse descent, and the raven was a huge part of their history, a bird of their folklore that was an all-knowing messenger, a protector. And that is why you will see ravens throughout Lee McQueen's work. He learned how his ancestors were probably servants to a lord who invaded Ireland and the Western Isle of Scotland, and though Joyce was never able to find an exact connection between her husband's ancestors and the McQueens of Skye, she was sure they suffered tremendously over the centuries, fighting in the Jacobite Rebellion and the Battle of Culloden in 1746, which they believed their ancestors fought in to defend the Isle of Skye. And we also know that around the 1800s, Lee's ancestors made their way to London. By 1888, one of his family members was living on 2829 Dorset Street, a street in London notorious for being robbed or assaulted. It was labeled the worst street to live on, but it became notoriously infamous because of the serial killer Jack the Ripper, who murdered at least 5 women in the East End, one of which was Mary Jane Kelly, thought to be the Ripper's last victim, and whose body was discovered in the back of 26 Dorset Street, 2 doors down from the McQueen family home. Lee's Anglo-Scottish heritage meant everything to him. It gave him a sense of belonging. It seems he may have come to identify with them, viewing them as outsiders who fought against the system. And in 2007, Lee would finally visit the Isle of Skye, where he walked upon a random cemetery that eerily had a tombstone with the name Alexander McQueen on it. Lee loved it so much that after his passing, he too would be buried on the Isle of Skye, bearing the same name, with the words "Love looks not with the eyes, but with the mind," a tattoo he had on his arm, which was a direct line from Helena in A Midsummer Night's Dream, on which Andrew Bolton said, in her contemplations, Helena believes that love has the power to transform something ugly into something beautiful, because love is propelled by subjective perceptions of the individual, not by objective assessments of appearance.
I seem sad at times about my work and my life. It's sad, but I'm not bitter because I'm grateful for everything that's happened in my life. But I know when the time is to give it up.
This belief was not only shared by McQueen, but also critical to his creativity, and it is the fundamental foundations of understanding Lee Alexander McQueen, a man who took the ugly moments of his life and tried to turn them into something beautiful, armored to protect women. And now we can start at the beginning. Lee Alexander McQueen was born March 17, 1969, in southeast London, and was the youngest of 4 children. He was called Blue Eyes not only because of his teal blue eyes, but because he was the baby of the family, and he occupied a special place in their home and in the heart of their mother, Joyce, and his siblings. Soon after his birth, Lee's father, Ron, suffered a breakdown after having worked 6 days a week, nonstop for years, to take care of his children. Lee's brother Michael said when Dad was a lorry driver, he would get up at 5 a.m. and arrive back at 9 p.m. 6 days a week. And he actually had to be institutionalized after this breakdown at the Victorian Asylum Cane Hill Hospital. Now, there are differing accounts as to how long he was actually there. His wife said he was there around 3 weeks, but Lee's oldest brother remembers it being closer to 2 years. And I tend to believe this solely because Lee would go on to have a fascination with this asylum, saying it sparked his interest in life and death, and if his father were only there 3 weeks, there's no way a baby as young as Lee would remember a place like that. It was also very clear from everything I read that the McQueen family struggled a lot while their father was away, and even after his release, he didn't work for a long period of time. Lee's sister Janet had to leave school at 15 to take a job in London, and her brother Tony would take a bus from the East End to Janet's work in the city, pick up her paychecks, and then take the bus home so that their mother could buy groceries. And when Tony turned 14, he started driving taxis around the city until he left school entirely to become a bricklayer. Their brother Michael would also become a taxi driver, just like their father Ron.
We were never what people call poor. My husband was a London taxi driver, so even though there were 6 children, they all had everything that they should have had.
But because Lee was so young, he didn't feel any of this. His age and being the youngest sheltered him a lot. He was doted on by his mother, which only strengthened their bond. And while Lee got preferential treatment from his mother and love and attention from his siblings, he didn't get much from his father. With Lee's brother Michael saying, "Mom, a teacher, did all the accounts." He was quite draconian, and she was far more liberal and creative. She would sit at the kitchen table doing watercolors and researching our family history.
I always encouraged them to read and have lots of books, because I myself loved history and things like that.
The family upbringing was strict, almost Victorian, as the children were often seen and not heard. Ron McQueen was a realist, born into the working class, who believed that any aspiration that was too far from reality would lead to struggles. Dreaming was totally fine, but it didn't put food on the table. So he tried to have his children face the realities of the world around them. And while it can seem harsh, it was a pretty realistic thing to do considering their socioeconomic background. They worked to live, to put food on the table. It was all about survival and making sure his kids were set up for success. And they all accepted this. Everyone that is except Lee. Lee wanted more, saying in a working class family in London, you have to bring the money in, and artistic routes were never the means to that end. But I put my foot down. I thought, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to get married, live in a 2-up, and be a bloody cab driver. And he wouldn't. And this caused a strain and complications in his relationship with his father that we will get into in a minute.
I did often wonder when he'd get a job, like what we'd call a proper job.
That was the last thing he was ever going to do. No, he was different right from the very beginning. As I said, he was different right from when he was young.
Growing up, Lee found escape in the creative dreamscape of his imagination. He was a bright, sensitive child who strived for something more. As a child, it was very clear Lee was obsessed with fashion. He started dressing up his mother and his sister, telling them what to wear and what not to wear. And then there was this moment that had a profound impact on his life. And then there was the time he drew a version of Cinderella and her gown on his sister's bedroom wall. And it had a profound impact on his life. Lee's friend Alice Smith said, he told me about the Cinderella drawing on the wall. I thought it was quite magical. I also remember him telling me about how one day his mom dressed him up when he was little, and he told his mom, I can't wear this. And when she asked why not, he said, it doesn't go. But this moment did also harbor some trauma, which I will also come back to in a second. Lee was an ambitious child. He was also wildly mischievous, a cheeky little boy who would steal his mother's teeth and put them on as a joke, take her stockings and pull them over his face to try and scare his family. And he would often go to his sister's swim lessons and jump in the pool in a pink tutu. He came to love being in the water so much that he joined the local swim club. And his brother Michael said, Mom used to go with them to every race. Lee joined the club but wanted to do synchronized swimming. I should have realized then that he was gay. And again, I will also come back to this in a second. All of this ties into it. Lee was not afraid to get up and perform in a grass skirt or tutu. He was a lively child, but that did get him into some trouble. Once,
there's a little place over here where my brother, I don't know if you ever see, if you looked at my brother, a picture, he's got a chipped stone in his side here. And that little fence over there is where he trod on and slipped on it, whacked it.
Another time he took a dive during a swim lesson and ended up smashing in his front teeth. Luckily they were his baby teeth, but the trauma caused his adult teeth to grow back twisted and damaged. His brother said it was one of the things that would give him a reason to be humiliated, to be picked on. He was called goofy and things like that. And it led him to become very self-conscious and very aware to keep his mouth closed at all times. In fact, one of Lee's ex-boyfriends said that he suffered from tooth pain most of his adult life. And in 1994, one of his teeth actually fell out while biting into a Big Mac. But these traumatic accidents and moments of his life didn't stop him from being an active child or being outside. He joined the local ornithologist club, a bird-watching club, and he would go twitching on the roof of flats, mesmerized and fascinated by the beauty and freedom of the birds above him, which makes sense as to why swallows taking flight would become a symbol of the McQueen legacy.
That's the house we lived at, number 11. The top, that would have been our bedroom there. There was 3 boys, we all in one bedroom. And you can see the birds flying about up the top. And I think if you see a lot of these shows and stuff like that, there's a lot of feathers and birds type of things going on. So perhaps that's where Lee gets a lot, or got a lot of his ideas.
His mother saw this curiosity in Lee and knew that despite his tough exterior, he had unusual vulnerabilities, and it made her do everything she could to protect and nurture him. His friend Alice Smith said he was this little fat boy from the East End with bad teeth who didn't have much to offer, but he had this one special thing, this talent, and Joyce believed in him. He was adored.
What, Mother?
Oh, no, Lee, not me.
It's not that it makes it smell.
Oh, Mother, come here.
No, and then if you don't smell that, you're smelling.
You broke the camera.
Yeah, no. She was very strong and powerful, and quite a lot was unsaid. But my God, you realise there was a really strong bond between them.
She made him feel like he could do anything.
And his childhood friends described him as different, artistic, a bit flamboyant, a bit of a showman, but extremely shy. And maybe it was because of his growing awareness of his own sexuality. Now, Lee would say at a young age that he knew he was gay, telling people, I was sure of myself and my sexuality, and I've got nothing to hide. I went straight from my mother's womb onto the gay parade. and said that he was often referred to as the pink sheep of his family. However, those who knew him refute these claims, as Lee was probably just masking a much darker truth, a truth much worse. He was beaten up by bullies, called names like McQueer, Queenie, and Queer Boy Queenie, and it wasn't any better at home. Lee's father, Ron, had long suspected that his son was gay, and after finding out that Lee had drawn the picture of Cinderella on his sister's wall, he immediately wallpapered over it. He didn't like that Lee was maybe gay, or I guess had gay tendencies. But years later, when Lee was older, he would ask his father if he could remove the wallpaper to find the drawing, and Ron told him, if you peel off the wallpaper, you can paper the whole fucking room again. This moment had such a profound impact on Lee's life, and it's so obvious from everybody who talks about it.
I guess he knew from an early age that he wanted to be a fashion designer, from what I've heard from the age of 3. Stories of him drawing dresses underneath the wallpaper.
What were you when you knew you wanted to design clothes?
I was like 3 years old.
What's your first memory of it?
Living in this council house with my sisters and my brothers, drawing this dress on a peeled wall. The paper had come off and there was a bit of bare wall, and I drew this one dress. It's my earliest memory of a sketch.
And do you have any record of it at all?
No, I wanted to go back and chip the cement off. I know we sold the house years ago, but I always wanted to go back and know exactly still the picture.
I don't know if Ron didn't like that his son was gay, or if he worried that being gay would make his life a lot harder. I don't know. I do know that Ron wanted Lee to grow up and have a job worthy of a man.
My dad wanted me to be some sort of mechanic or something, but it never worked out that way.
But Lee never would do that. So Ron did his best to ignore his youngest, and Lee's older brother Michael said there was always an atmosphere when he and Dad were together. Lee would be at home sewing, and Dad would turn around and say, "Why don't you get yourself a proper job?"
From my granddad, he got the sense of humour, which was at times wicked.
All crack it, son, all crack it.
And this all sounds harsh, I know. But Lee and Ron had a very complicated relationship. Ron would go on to support Lee in the only ways he knew how. In years later, when Lee was setting up his first shows, Ron would actually drive his taxi off hours to help Lee transport his clothes from the studio to the showroom. And occasionally he would attend the shows, standing all the way in the back, while his wife sat front row and fed the models backstage.
You always sit there a bit apprehensive.
I do, don't I?
I
do.
She's
sit
waiting
there,
to see.
I am a bundle of nerves. I think, oh my God, what am I going to see this time?
I think we all are.
Lee would later say that his father had less of an issue with him being gay and his choice of work the more famous and financially stable he became. I think Ron really cared about financial stability. Like many probably understand, their relationship was complicated, but that's not to say that Ron didn't love Lee. He just came from an entirely different generation and experienced an entirely different way of life than the one Lee would have. And this growing divide between the two worlds that Lee would live in is something that we will see as his story progresses. He never fit in with his family, but he never fit into the fashion world either. It's like he lived in this in-between where he always had one foot on either side, and neither side truly accepted him.
I think that he struggled coming out of that background and going into the world.
And that will become more apparent at his passing, but it's all this to just say that they didn't understand each other, but that doesn't mean that they didn't love each other. Without a doubt, Lee loved his family, and they loved him. His own mother, who he had a wonderful relationship with, had a difficult time with his coming out. Lee would say that he came out in ID magazine around 1994 before his Banshee collection.
Come out. I was gay when I was 19 in ID magazine. I never liked it just to
And Joyce was furious, telling him, "Why do you have to publicize your private life?" And Lee responded by telling her, "It's not my private life. It's just the way I am." Everyone would come around eventually because they loved him.
I didn't know till late on. My sisters and mum obviously knew, but I never did. I never looked at my brother in that way. And it wasn't until about 10, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, maybe a bit more. He phoned me up to tell me that. So I said, well, whatever, you know, there's not nothing you can do about it. Everyone loves him the same, so that's his life.
But Lee and his father would continue to have a difficult relationship, and that's just the way it was. So Lee was being bullied at school, he was hiding his sexuality, and he was being shunned by his father at home. And if that wasn't already bad, but it does get worse. Sometime around the ages of, I think, 8 to 10, Lee was being abused by his brother-in-law. And for the life of me, I don't know his name, I don't care to look it up, fuck that guy. But at the time, no one knew what was happening to him, as his brother-in-law had threatened him and scared him into silence. And it would take him decades, even after his brother-in-law died, for Lee to confide in anyone. And even then, he couldn't even go into detail. Not that he had to go into detail, but everybody he talked to about this said that he could only get so far in confiding in them.
We were just in our flat. It was literally just in the middle of the evening. He said, oh, by the way, I was abused when I was a child by my brother-in-law. It just came out, and he started crying, and we started talking, and then almost as soon as he'd started telling me all of that, he said, oh, anyway, I don't want to talk about that anymore.
He had a very difficult time coming to terms with the abuse that he suffered. Many who knew him said it seemed to affect him deeply, unsettling him and leading him to mistrust those close to him. They believed the abuse is what led him down a dark route, with one friend saying he was hurt and angry, and he said that it had robbed him of his innocence. I thought it brought a darkness into his soul. Lee even said, there's a side of my life, my early childhood, I wish to forget about. I was born to some parts of aggression, but maybe it made me stronger. His friend Billy Boy said he got the impression Lee endured it for a long time, as he was not well adjusted, a masochistic, insecure, unhappy person with low self-esteem, saying it was strange because he had a great talent and people told him all the time. Wintour and others would tell him endlessly how much they admired his work, but it was so sad because it didn't compensate for his insecurity. And it would take Lee almost 30 years to tell his sister what he had gone through at the hands of her husband. But by that point, her husband had been dead decades, but the pain and fear were still very present for him. Janet was heartbroken when she found out, harboring guilt for never knowing or being able to save him. But Lee never blamed her. He knew that she didn't know, and that she was just as scared of her husband as he was, because the brother-in-law would physically assault her, often in front of Lee. And in my opinion, the brother-in-law probably did this to scare him and show him, this is what I can do to you. And I think this is when Lee started to fuse him and his sister's experiences together, seeing Janet as the archetypal woman, vulnerable but strong, a survivor, and she would become the blueprint for everything Lee created. This was the woman he wanted to protect and empower with his work.
He was very brave. As my brother, I thought he was one of the bravest people out there because he didn't mind to put things out there perhaps that other people wouldn't in the fashion world.
He wanted to protect all women, to make men and people afraid of the women that he dressed, so he made them armor to shield them from danger. In 1980, at 11 years old, Lee transferred schools and hated every second of it. Every teacher there saw him as just another East End boy going nowhere, so they didn't bother to help him. It was absolute and utter hell. And towards the end of his time there, friends and family began to notice a shift in Lee. He was suffering these sudden bouts of frustration and anger. His moods would go up and down, and he would act out. One friend said, I wouldn't say he was bipolar, but he had his ups and downs with moods. He had a bit of a temper on him as well. I remember in certain lessons, he would be chatting, and he'd get told off. He would erupt and kick off and get thrown out or put in detention. And again, it would later come out that Lee had suffered even more abuse, this time from a teacher. And when those close to him found out, they said it all seemed to make sense. And thank God, when he turned 16, he was done with school. He was free, and the only thing he had on his mind was escape, to be as free as the birds he used to watch from the rooftop. After graduation, Lee knew he needed to do something with his life, but something that he wanted to do. So in 1985, he enrolled in an art course to learn the basics of dressmaking. He started making skirts for his sister, who remembers them being so tight she could barely lift her legs, and sometimes they would fall apart as she walked. But he was learning. He was researching. He was reading books on fashion and fashion designers, and one of the books that had a profound impact on him was McDowell's Dictionary of 20th Century Fashion, a book that argues fashion has always been about the domination of women, the argument being that men manipulate women, treating them like objects, using fancy dresses and clothes as bait and reward, arguing that clothing was a symbol of suppression. As a woman gifted an expensive dress or piece of jewelry will feed their man's ego by wearing it and telling her friends with her expensive appearance how rich and powerful her man is to be able to buy and possess such a beautiful object such as herself. Lee was both intrigued and shocked by this argument and vowed to always subvert this attitude, making it so that the very act of wearing his clothes would be a statement to the world that the McQueen woman wasn't a passive object, but an active and potentially dangerous subject.
There's no point in doing a show and everyone walk out, oh, nice clothes. You spend thousands on these things. You want some sort of reaction at the end of it.
And in 1986, Lee took major steps towards his future. Him and his mother Joyce were watching a docuseries on the art of tailoring and how the trade is in danger of dying out because of the shortage of apprentice tailors on Savile Row. Now, after watching this, Joyce convinced Lee to go down there and try to get an apprenticeship.
There was some news programme saying that there was lack of apprentices for tailors in Savile Row, which was like a dying trade at the time. A bit like electricians or plumbers. It wasn't very fashionable, but I was there to learn my trade.
So Lee took the tube to number 30 Savile Row, the street in central London that is the heart of London's bespoke tailoring trade, the home of well-known names in traditional men's clothing, synonymous with good taste, refinement, and craftsmanship for centuries. Among them was Anderson and Shepherd, who held a royal warrant as outfitters to Prince Charles. Lee knew the best way to move forward was to learn the proper construction of clothes, and he was ready and willing to put in the work. The environment was said to be strict and formal. There was a clear hierarchy, with one of Lee's former classmates saying, "In those days we were often seen and not heard." Lee was like us all, straight from school, a blank canvas. But Lee didn't find comfort or safety there, as many of his fellow classmates teased him for being gay. So Lee kind of just kept his head down and worked, spending his time perfecting his stitches, which is something all apprentices did until they could stitch like it was second nature, and only after they were fluent in stitching could they learn the parts of making a jacket, like interior padding, how to canvas a jacket, the pockets, the lapels, the buttons. Lee learned how to work with velvet and tweed, different weights of suiting cloths, horsehair and canvas, how to handle and move them, how to cut dress coats and morning coats and jackets. He was training his eyes and his sense of spatial awareness was growing. He was learning how to see the final product as the piece progressed. His former classmate said, "That's the thing about Lee, when he went on to do his collections. He knew how to properly look at things. If he saw a mistake, he would rectify it by ripping it apart and starting again." And with fashion, it's easier to wing it, but when you are a tailor, you see something wrong, you fix it, no matter how long it takes. And that was Lee. Within 2 years, he was able to make his own jacket from start to finish, something that normally took apprentices around 4 years to learn. Lee was obviously keen to learn, and he had a natural ability.
Apprentices. Obviously was Alexander McQueen. When he came here, his name was Lee. But only after he left here, he changed his name to Alexander. And he worked here for 2 years. And in that 2 years, he learnt a lot from us. He learnt how to make a cut and make a coat up to halfway stage. And then, of course, obviously, he's gone on to do much better things as he's lived here.
Though Anderson and Shepherd would deny that Lee ever worked there when he first started out in the fashion industry, they later said, "We taught him technique, but he had the talent in his blood. You can't teach that to anyone." However, after 2 years, Lee started to withdraw and eventually stopped showing up altogether. And then he went and took an apprenticeship with Gives and Hawkes.
I certainly remember him working with us, and though sadly we lost his talent, no way were we going to keep him. His mind and nature was inquisitive, never short of asking questions. Why this? Why that? Why put a cut in a coat here rather than there, to create a chest or to create suppression in a waist? All this was very evident from the way he worked and the way he talked.
Where he worked for another year until he left them too, this time claiming to have endured a climate of homophobia. Lee's ex, Andrew Grove, said Lee felt extremely class-conscious and uncomfortable at both houses, calling them bullies and fat shamers, often saying that Lee would tell him that they would measure you, and if you were big, they would write down your numbers followed by the letters FC. So let's say you were a 56. They would write down 56 FC, and the FC stood for fat cunt. So Lee left, not wanting any part of that. But he would get back at all of them, years later starting a rumor that he left a secret note in the lining of one of Prince Charles's jackets that read, "I'm a cunt." So there's questions about the validity of this, as Anderson and Shepard has said that this is a baseless rumor.
But then, of course, as everybody's heard, I mean, he said he did drawings in Prince Charles's clothes.
I'm in Savile Row, at the top of this old building, like, with a load of old tailors, and it's really boring. It just happens to be Prince Charles's jacket I was working on at the time. And so I draw this big willy on it. You know, like you do.
This part of the jacket, inside here is a canvas. So he said he drew obscene things on the canvas. So we got the jacket back, but when we looked inside, there was nothing there. But he mentioned it several times, but it wasn't true. So he was a bit of a rebel, wasn't he, really?
However, Lee never took this back. Even later in life, when he was mature and, you know, reminiscing about how he was crazy as a kid.
I didn't embroider it, I thought it would waste my time. I wrote it with a biro.
So it leads me to believe that he probably did this, and Anderson and Shepard probably covered it up to avoid any major controversy, because you can't have the Prince of England walking around in a coat that says, "I'm a cunt."
I knew I couldn't survive in a place like that for the rest of my life, cluttered in a small workshop, sitting on a bench, padding lapels. God, it was so boring. But I did have a passion, and I was good at it. I was good at tailoring a jacket. I was quick at learning, and quick at learning trousers. I wanted to learn everything. Give me everything. A single-breasted jacket is a single-breasted jacket. It doesn't move on. A double-breasted is a double-breasted. You know what I mean? It's like a jacket's a jacket, but I wanted to pull the lapels around the back of the neck, up the arse, and everywhere else.
After Savile Row, Lee did some freelance work for Berman and Nathan's, making costumes for Les Miserables and Miss Saigon. And here is where he was awakened to the rich cultures of Asia, and where he developed a passion for 16th century tailoring techniques.
I also learned how to cut. 16th century way of cutting. All the frock coats for Les Miserables was the original way of cutting clothes in that period. And that comes through in my work today as well, all the historic references.
And it is also believed that these large-scale productions had an influence on his own theatrical catwalks. But at this time, Lee was like a sponge. He wanted to learn everything and do everything and meet everyone and do everything possible. So he didn't work there long, because in 1989, he read an article on Koji Tatsuno and was so inspired by his story that he immediately set out to work with him at his brand Culture Shock, a hybrid of avant-garde Japanese and traditional British tailoring, where he transformed fabrics into 3D sculptures. Lee wanted to work with Tatsuno, but he also wanted to learn from the classic Savile Row tailor that Tatsuno had working in his studio. He wanted that guy to teach him how to make a frock coat. So Lee went to Tatsuno's studio.
It was beginning of the 90s when I had a bespoke tailoring shop in Mount Street, and he just walked in one day. He looked like skinhead, but just told me he can cut frock coat much better than 50 years old tailor I had. So I was very curious and just told him, okay, like, show me what you can do.
Got hired as a pattern cutter and learned how to make a frock coat. And this would become important to his first collection. And though Lee didn't end up working with Tatsuno long, the impact and influence his work had on Lee's work is evident. He taught him how to cut without using patterns, how to mold materials to the body to create shape, and how to realize your fantasies and translate them onto the runway. Lee came to find the art of pattern cutting liberating, and after leaving Tatsuno, he did some work at Red or Dead with John McKitterick.
He was a sweet boy from the East End, looking to make money. We needed technical help. Machinists, we needed pattern cutters, we needed people who had hands-on experience in making clothes. Gave me no attitude, was never late, always knew what he was doing, always delivered. He listened continually to Sinead O'Connor, which was quite odd because no one else liked Sinead O'Connor at the time. You know, he really liked her for some reason. I always remember him with his Walkman on, listening to Sinead O'Connor.
But he only worked there a few months before he told John that he had an ambition to actually work in fashion. So John told Lee that the next logical step would be to go to Italy and get an internship.
He must have asked me questions. What can I do next? How can I push myself forward? And at the time, all the designers in Italy were opening diffusion lines.
So John gave Lee all of his contacts in Italy, and Lee told him that he actually only had one ambition. So he booked a one-way ticket to Milan in March 1990 with the intention of getting a job with Romeo Gigli.
He went to Italy with no language, no place to stay, no money, no qualifications. I thought within a week he'll be back, you know, with his tail between his legs. I get a call from Lee from Italy. He'd landed a job as an assistant for Romeo Gigli. To say I was shocked was an understatement.
Romeo Gigli was a standout Italian designer known for mixing London's post-punk street fashion with Japanese avant-garde styles. and Lee was drawn to Jiglee's spirit of romanticism and his ability to produce shows that evoked a strong emotional reaction. So Lee went to Jiglee's studio without an appointment and a portfolio filled with costume designs, and he was hired on the spot. He only worked there a few months before he had to leave the company as they were having issues. But even though he only worked there a few months, Lee was remembered by the staff for drawing these hybrid figures that will become a focal point of much of his career. Lee was always obsessed with the idea of nature gone wrong, the destruction of nature, and what happens in the evolutionary process in the face of nature going wrong. So these hybrid figures and this idea of hybridization, I guess, will become important later on. After landing in London, Lee went back to work with John McKitterick before expressing his intentions to make a career in fashion. Not just to work in fashion, but to have a career in it. So John advised Lee to apply to Central St. Martin's master program because he thought with all the experience he had in the industry thus far, it could be counted towards a bachelor's degree. So John gave Lee his contact at Central St. Martin's, which was Bobby Hilson, the founder and director of the MA course. Now again, Lee went there with no appointment and an armful of samples in hand. However, instead of applying to be a student, he went there with the intention of getting a job.
He was hovering outside my office. I saw this unprepossessing, I must say, very shabby, very unattractive boy with a bundle of clothes over his arm outside my office. I said to him, "Who are you looking for?" And he said, "I've come to see you."
But she couldn't hire him. And instead, she was so impressed by his go-getter attitude and his stubbornness that she offered him a place in her MA program instead.
He said he wanted a job, and I knew that was out of the question because he was about the same age as the students, and they would never have taken him seriously. But I became more intrigued by him. You know, you sense something in someone. Can't teach talent, but what you can do is make them better at what they do or more professional. I found myself saying, "Well, I think you should come on my course." It was pretty extraordinary because, you know, you interview endless students to decide who you will take on the course, and they come to you from all over the world. And with Alexander, he just arrived.
Despite him not having the same qualifications as the other MA students, Lee never faltered, and that MA program was a pivotal stepping point in his career. He would later say that Bobby Hilson was like a mother to him and someone he owed his career to. He started the program in October 1990 and immediately felt a sense of belonging. Being around like-minded people with a freedom to express himself.
St. Martin's was the place to go. But what I liked about it was the freedom of expression and being surrounded by like-minded people.
But he used it. He used it as I intended him to use it. And he'd come to a painting or a book and you know, not having had a formal education, it was all new to him. And that was it. He reinterpreted things in his way. It wasn't filtered through with a lot of us who've had more conventional backgrounds. I loved that.
He tried to cram in as much as possible into the course load so that he could learn everything possible. He even made a few friends, including Simon Unglis and Rebecca Barton. Simon Unglis was of a similar working class background, and he was also gay. They said that they were not your typical gay men. They didn't have chiseled bodies or danced with their shirts off, but they hit up every gay bar in London and partied all night. They looked different. They were bullied for their appearances and their sexuality, but they understood each other. They loved what was happening in Paris. They loved Ezzedine Leah, Margiela, and Jean Colonna, obsessed with fashion, but extremely poor. And because of their economic situation, Lee began creating his own copies of their work, making Simon Unglis a vinyl rubber Jean Colonna style suit and a Margiela coat on which Unglis said was one of the most incredible jackets he had ever owned. But outside of fashion and school, what drew them together was their love and respect for nature. They loved birds, skins, crystals, fossils, eggs, feathers, and bones. Simon Unglis grew up in the country and spent most of his childhood collecting. And Lee was fascinated, often visiting Simon at his family home where they would gather and collect together. In college, Simon Unglis started making these cabinet of curiosity prints of superimposed images of butterflies and eggs over historic Scottish Highland tartan. Now this print stuck with Lee, and that is why there are a lot of prints of various collages of things in his work. And it is also why when you go to any McQueen exhibit, there is this cabinet of curiosities collection. It all started with Simon Unglis. And as you will come to see as we move through this story, Lee's legacy, Lee's career, was actually a collaboration between him and his friends, between him and the people he loved and admired. And that's something that I absolutely love about this story.
But Lee was very much like that. He always used to say, you know, anyone can make the tea around here. meaning he can make the cup of tea,
Yeah.
or anyone, or, you know, it was kind of welcome to everyone's ideas, and yeah, very collaborative, I think. And I think that's always great when, you know, he liked all the young people around, and, you know, everybody speaking up and giving their point of view. He always kind of encouraged that.
Another friend of Lee's was Rebecca Barton, and she remembered Lee as a harsh critic who could alienate himself with his aggressive attitude, who could make other students cry for the things he said about their work, and yet he was sensitive and shy to criticism. He could be cruel to some, but Rebecca remembers just how lovely and funny and quite naughty he could be.
I think we got on really well because we had the same sense of humour, and he laughed all the time, so he was just funny and disrespectful, and he'd do catwalk shows down the corridor. He'd just muck around. Whenever he could muck around, he'd muck around.
For her birthday that year, he actually threw her a surprise party and gifted her a necklace with a black and white photo of a naked Lee wrapped in plastic wrap. And he would do this again for his friend Simon Costin, gifting him a photo of his face bound by tape, wearing one of Simon Costin's bird necklaces over his bare chest. Lee loved this whole naughty sexual thing. We'll see it as we go through.
There's always an energy in London, the poverty, the unemployment, the drug-induced environment, the nightlife.
He would take me to gay bars, and he would take me to lesbian bars, and he'd like sit me there and he'd go, you know, this is what you want, this is what you want. I go, no, I really just want to go home. Can I just go home and do my homework?
You used to make clothes to go out, and you used to make something just for that night. I think Lee took everything. I mean, that's one of Lee's strengths, that he took a lot of barriers aesthetic. It's transgressive, it's in your face, and thought, how does this translate onto a runway?
He was loving his time in London and at Central St. Martin's. That is until Bobby Hilson was replaced as director of the MA course by Louise Wilson. And it was said by many that Louise Wilson went out of her way to make Lee's time at Central St. Martin's unbearable. Known for her straight-talking toughness and chaotic temper, including the occasional drop-kicking of a mannequin when students dropped their stitches, she was a hothead, and her relationship with Lee was tenuous.
Of course, why would you say, I think I'm aggressive? I don't know. People, of course, my partner says I'm aggressive. So I think teaching is a very stressful job.
And while Lee could accept criticism when warranted, it felt to many that Louise Wilson would go out of her way to pick on his work. They felt that if she could have gotten rid of him, she would have. They felt that Louise Wilson was so bullish towards Lee because she was jealous of his talents and how everything seemed to come naturally to him. She didn't like that he didn't have a bachelor's degree or that he could finish assignments in minutes and sketch patterns by eye. He was often heard telling her and her staff that he had been professionally trained on Savile Row and had learned how to cut patterns from Romeo Gigli and Koji Tatsuno, and it drove them crazy.
And he was not frightened to tell people, I know better than you, even the tutors. You know, he was a bit of a nightmare student because he knew so much.
I'm sure he was a pain and did interrupt people. He didn't actually dare interrupt me.
Sometimes the pattern tutor would tell Lee his patterns weren't good, and then Lee would just continue to follow his own pattern, make the clothes, and it would fit the model perfectly. And the pattern tutor would still say that he was wrong because he didn't do it the way they wanted him to do it. Lee had a lot of experience in the industry, and I think that made Louise Wilson and her staff nervous because he didn't hang on to their every word. He refused to conform to their way of doing things, and it sort of feels like he could have taught them a thing or two. But he drove her absolutely nuts, and he didn't like her. He didn't like the way she ran the course and would outright refuse some of her requests, including a class project where the students were asked to make an outfit for the Dame Shirley Porter. Now, I still don't know what a dame is. I don't know who the Dame Shirley Porter is, but Lee refused this assignment. He didn't want to take part and told Louise Wilson he wasn't going to make clothes for anyone who was privileged and who wasn't prepared to pay for them. And good for him. Honestly, the idea that rich people always get everything for free literally makes me want to scorch the earth. And I get it. I know how it makes sense, but I hate it. And anyway, it's alleged that Louise Wilson once tried to move Lee from the MA studios into the BA studios in an attempt to try and humiliate him, but it didn't work. Lee just endured. He wasn't going to let Louise Wilson ruin his time there. And I know I'm sitting here and I'm blowing up Lee's ego and being like, he's the best, and he knew better than his teachers, and blah, blah, blah. But I didn't go to school with this guy. I wasn't even born yet. All of this came from his fellow classmates, the people who knew he was talented. Even if they didn't like him, they knew he was more talented than his teachers. So this isn't coming from me, okay? Everybody has their faults. I'll be the first to admit that. And we'll talk about Lee's throughout this video and all the other videos.
St. Martin's
is a lot about hype and not much substance. And as a student, I spent most of my time in the pool room cafe playing pool because I didn't think I learned anything there. Oh God, I'll get out. I don't want to know my t-shirts. I'll get out.
Louise will be home to you in any minute.
Oh, she hates me with a
Oh, really?
I should have thought I had an ounce of tongue in that baby, so.
Oh, really?
But she's eating her words.
Have I admired some secretly? Yes. You know, profoundly talented, an innate skill, and you don't want them to get swallowed by an industry that doesn't understand them or whatever. But most of them have found their way through.
McQueen came to the college as a slightly mature student anyway, from a Savile Row background. He was like a fab student to teach because he was absolutely passionate about fashion.
In October 1991, a year into the program, Lee and a few friends traveled to Paris to sneak into the fashion shows. His friend Rebecca Barton had secured them tickets to the Givenchy show. None of them were impressed by it, and Barton actually remembers Lee telling her that he would never design for a place like that. But that's for the next video. When they returned from their trip, freshly inspired, they got to work planning their graduation collections. For Lee, he knew his graduation collection was going to reference a Victorian costume book he had found, and he was going to draw inspiration from YSL, specifically his wardrobe for Catherine Deneuve in Belle de Joie, a 1967 surrealist film about a bored housewife living out her sexual fantasies in a Paris brothel. Now, around this time, Lee was introduced to Sean Lean. Sean Lean was a traditionally trained goldsmith who Lee met through a mutual friend at St. Martin's.
And then, through a moment of serendipity, I met Alexander McQueen, and then off we went. And I was 22 years old. He was 22. He was at Central St. Martin's doing his MA in fashion. I just finished my apprenticeship, and we became the best of friends. We met through a mutual friend at Central St. Martin's. He was doing his course. It was kind of funny. We were worlds apart. You know, he was in fashion. I was in Hatton Garden. I was a classically trained goldsmith. But we became really, really good friends. He was coming up to his graduation year, and he would come and meet me after work every other day, and we'd go out as, you know, young teenagers. Well, we were just turned 20 then, so, you know, as you do. And then sometimes he would come up to my workshop to pick me up from work, and then we'd go out. And he was fascinated by what he saw. I think he was impressed by the attention to detail and the level of craftsmanship. And him having come from a Savile Row background, I think he respected it. Kind of his background and mine kind of mirrored each other in a way, because I came from a very traditional goldsmithing background, where he had come from a very traditional Savile Row background. He was fascinated by my skills as a craftsman, and he saw the hunger in me, and he saw that I had that element, which he had too. And we were the same age, and we were of the same. He was East London, I was a North London boy. We kind of had the same energies, so we fed off each other quite brilliantly, I thought.
And this man would become pivotal to Lee's legacy, and also one of his closest friends. Also among that close group would be Simon Costin, a jeweler who at this time had been featured in The Face magazine. Lee saw the article on Costin and reached out to see if he could use some of Costin's pieces in his graduation collection.
So Lee had seen some body sculpture jewellery that I'd made during the late 80s. And I used things like sort of bird's feet earrings and claws and animal pieces and this sort of thing. And he wrote to me as a student from Central St. Martin's saying, I know you're probably not making jewellery anymore, but have you got anything left I could use for my degree show? And Lee used them for his degree show. So that's the first time we met. But he was so funny. And we just got on really well. So I thought, yeah, of course you can. And I trusted him. I'm always keen to help students, because I was one. So I would appreciate that if I was a student asking for. And so, yeah, I was just more than happy to help out. I'd like to say it was the work, but to be honest, we just went clubbing all the time and bars, and it was the friendship first, and then the work came later. Because at that point, it hadn't developed very much. Just left college, so it was all very early on. But no, it was very much the friendship that sparked that working relationship.
Later coming onto Lee's team as set director and art director.
I kept thinking, I could do your catwalk, I could do your shows. But, he didn't have any money at that point. And I'd never done shows before at all. So it was only later, I think The Birds was the first show I sort of painted a stripe down the middle of the road.
Yeah.
I mean, we had nothing. We had no money whatsoever.
But again, we'll get there. But for now, Lee wanted to use Simon Costin's pieces in his graduation collection. A graduation collection that many of Lee's fellow classmates believed earned him the award for Student of the Year. And if you aren't familiar with Central St. Martin's, every year the graduating class gets to pick one student who gets the award for Student of the Year. And their collection, I think, is shown last or first. I'm not sure exactly, but it's a really high distinction. John Galliano won his, and Lee's classmates believe he had earned that award. But Louise Wilson would not give it to him and instead gave it to another student instead. And that collection was Jack the Ripper Stalks His Victims, based on Lee's interest in the macabre, telling the press, "I don't think I suffer from anything really. It's just that I'm very in tune with my melancholy side. I don't see it as depression." The entire collection was inspired by so many things, like the book Perfume by Patrick Sutskin, about a perfume apprentice who murdered virgins in a quest to find the perfect scent. Lee's friend said the character in that book is him all visceral with all his senses heightened. He liked nasty rawness, but of course he balanced that with complete beauty, and that was the true inspiration. Lee's own emotional identification with the victims. It was a gesture to move away from the ugly realities of exploitation and abuse. He presented 10 looks, like a calico skirt covered in papier-mâché magazine articles with burn marks. But the most striking piece of the collection was a 3-point origami frock coat in a cherry pink satin with a large barbed thorn print that was paired with black trousers and a black bustier top. Lee casted himself as a stylistic serial killer who slashed and cut clothes to refashion the female silhouette. He used his own hair, sewing it into the lining of coats, jackets, and skirts, a reference to Jack the Ripper, who would often cut his victims' hair, as well as the Victorian tradition in which prostitutes would sell their hair for money, and it would be put into little boxes or brooches that people would buy and give to their lovers. And like the women killed by Jack the Ripper, all of the clothes were frayed and torn with burn marks. There was red paint splattered liberally over everything to denote blood. It was Punk's fury reborn, and Lee's sources came from deep within.
To me, at that time, that was the pinnacle, seeing him at his NA show. I never doubted his talent, but I wondered whether he'd ever discipline it enough to actually, control it. One didn't realize that he would produce a collection which would be so exciting.
The very next day, Lee and Rebecca Barton were sitting in the lounge at Central St. Martin's when Isabella Blow, an influential stylist, called the school asking about Lee McQueen and his graduation collection.
I was sitting on the floor. I couldn't even get a seat at the St. Martin's show. And the pieces went past me and they moved in a way I've never seen. And I wanted them. They were modern. They were classical. The colours were very extreme. He would do a black coat, but then he'd line it with human hair and it was blood red inside. So it was like a body. It was like the flesh with blood. And I just thought, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen.
Lee and Rebecca overheard the phone call, and she vividly remembers turning to Lee and saying, "You're going to be really famous." And you could see in his face that he was excited. And from there, everything seemed to change overnight. Isabella Blow was a then associate director at British Vogue, and once the assistant of Anna Wintour, and she made it her mission to nurture London's fashion geniuses, so she attended every St. Martin's graduation collection to spot potential stars, and she loved Lee's work. Because just like Lee, she used fashion as a protection against the world, against the inadequacies of her own body and looks as she perceived them. Her compulsion to disguise herself linked her to Lee, as well as her traumatic childhood, in which she watched her 5-year-old brother drown in a pool, unable to save him. The pair's relationship was bound by their love for the power of fashion and its transformative capabilities, how fashion could change the way one feels, how you walk, how you think. With Lee later saying, "With me, metamorphosis is a bit like plastic surgery, but less drastic. I try to have the same effect with my clothes, but ultimately I do this to transform mentalities more than the body." As time moved on, the pair bonded over the things they were too scared to say out loud, the things they could never tell anyone else. Isabella Blow and Lee found safety and understanding in each other.
The same as me, she doesn't care. She doesn't care what people think. At the end of the day, we're separate entities to everyone else, and we have our own personal view about things.
It's when you fall in love with somebody and then you love it and you nurture it and you look after it like it's your garden. People garden, they cook, they do the same thing. My ingredients are clothes.
She bought his entire graduation collection for around £5,000, and she's the primary reason much of his early work is still around. But we will get into that conundrum as we move through the story. After buying the collection, Isabella took Lee under her wing, and she decided that she was going to nurture him and try to help him push his career forward. Plum Sykes, then assistant to Isabella Blow, said, He came into the office wearing like jeans falling off his bottom and a checkered lumberjack shirt. He looked like a complete yob, and that was the image he was cultivating. I was intimidated by the fact that he was a working class boy, like a rough and tough Cockney, like a Dickens character. He was from the East End of London. I'd never been to the East End of London. And this, what she says, will be important later on too, because this is exactly the reason that much of London's fashion establishment hated him. Isabella Blow knew this too, and she did everything she could to get him a seat at the table, a place in English society. And that is why, as she claims, she started calling Lee by his middle name Alexander.
His real name is Lee. Everyone else calls him Lee. I call him Alexander because I think of Alexander the Great.
Because it sounded grander and more appropriate for a young designer who wanted and needed to make a mark in English society. However, Lee would contradict this by saying that he dropped his first name when he started working for himself, as he was on unemployment benefits and needed to hide his identity from the Department of Health and Social Security. Both sides make sense. I'm not here to argue which one's right. I will say, outside of wanting to hide from the government, Lee hated being called Alexander. Calling him Lee was a sign of how close you were to him. It was the name he preferred. And at one point, even his own mother began calling him Alexander, and he begged her to stop. Alice Smith, his close friend, always said he was Lee to us. And I don't think Isabella Blow was trying to be disrespectful or mean by calling him Alexander. I think that she knew in order for him to succeed in the high-stakes and pretentious world of English fashion, he would need a makeover. So she started bringing him to assist on photo shoots and introduced him to her other protégés and friends, including Philip Treacy, Hussein Chalayan, Rifat Ozbek, and Manola Blahnik. She did everything she could to expose him to the world he was never accepted into, to a world he was never even exposed to. And only a few months later, in 1992, Lee moved in with Simon Unglis, and the pair became inseparable, often referring to each other as sister. Simon Unglis would inspire and stoke something in Lee after introducing him to the sadomasochistic book, The 120 Days of Sodom, by the Marquise de Sade. Throughout his career, Lee would come back to this book, saying, I gather some influence from the Marquise de Sade because I actually think of him as a great philosopher and a man of his time. When people found him just a pervert, I find him sort of influential in the way he provokes people's thoughts. It kind of scares me. That's the way I think.
Which historical figure would you like to meet most?
The Marquis de Sade.
And why?
Because for anyone who comes up with 120 days of Sodom must have had an exciting life. It makes my life sound banal.
And over the course of time, many friends would come to see the parallels between Lee and Sade, how they depicted dangerous women in a way that went beyond gender, and the connection between victim and aggressor. His friend Chris Bird said, that whole aspect of chronicling man's inhumanity to other men, not condoning it, but showing it. There was an element of romanticism in his work, but also cruelty. There was an aspect of bondage, but he wanted to liberate women and enable them to be fierce. Sade's work didn't just inspire Lee. It gave him permission to express his own sexuality without boundaries. Friends said that one of Lee's favorite greetings was to stick his finger in his butt and then thrust it in their face and say, meet Lee. He loved sex. He loved being outrageous. The more experimental, the better. Alice Smith recalls a story of Lee meeting a man in Clapham who tied him naked to a tree, ran away, and left Lee there till morning. And he loved it. This book, while disturbing to probably everybody, sparked something in him. But Lee was dead broke. He wasn't really able to create anything, later telling the press,
Survived on unemployment benefit. And I bought all my fabric. I bought all my fabrics with my dole money. And I went round to my parents for baked beans and tins of soup and things like that.
But all that changed in fall 1992 when Lee met Alice Smith in Cressida Pye of Smith & Pye, a recruitment agency that Lee went to find work. They got him interviews for Alberta Ferretti and Jill Sander, but he lost out because he didn't know how to fit into their world, showing up to his interviews in a full suit. And it hurt them, it hurt everyone around him, because they knew he was talented. It was obvious to everyone. So they really pushed him to start his own label. Isabella Blow was commissioning him to make outfits for her, and Alice Smith and Cressida were giving him money to make them clothes. And with the little money he received from his friends and from unemployment, he began experimenting with different materials, shapes, and techniques, until a collection started to form. his first official collection, a collection that sadly doesn't exist.
He said to me one day, I've decided to do my own collection. And I remember thinking, how on earth does he think he's going to have a business and make a collection? He has got nothing. He's got no money, no wherewithal, no studio, nobody to support him, nothing behind him. And yet he was determined this is what he was going to do.
And though the times seemed dire and Lee was struggling, Simon Unglis believes that this was the happiest Lee had ever been, saying, I think he was absolutely blissful, happy with what he was doing. He was creative and completely ecstatic. Those were difficult times because of finances and things like that, but personally, I think he was really happy. He had real friends, friends that cared about him, that wanted to see him succeed. And that first show was an absolute collaboration. Alice Smith worked as Lee's PR consultant, securing him press. Her firm helped even secure him a magazine cover for the collection, but because he was on unemployment benefits and didn't want to get caught, they had to wrap his face in tape to distort it. It was also the first time he was referred to as Alexander McQueen. That collection was Taxi Driver. Hailed as a groundbreaking show, there was nothing else like it happening in fashion. Ethereal and strange, powerful and romantic. However, like I said before, it doesn't exist. After the show, Simon Unglis and Lee packed up the collection into garbage bags, got into a taxi, and went to a club. And to avoid any coat check fees, they left the bag of clothes behind some garbage containers, went inside, danced and drank the night away, and the following morning they realized they had left the clothes behind. So they went back to the club, only to discover that the bags had been collected by the garbage trucks. But I'm still going to try and talk about the collection. A photo of one piece exists, and some of the pieces have since been recreated by Simon Unglis for an exhibit, so we're going to try. Taxi Driver was inspired by the 1976 film Taxi Driver and Lee's own father, who was a taxi driver. In the film, Robert De Niro plays an unstable taxi driver who becomes a vigilante, trying to save people and clean up the streets of New York. He identified with De Niro's vigilante character, as well as the exploited and abused Jodie Foster, who De Niro tries to save. So it was said that Lee printed De Niro's character on gray taffeta and turned it into a vest. He also experimented with plastic and latex, but the manipulation of latex actually started with Simon Unglis, who started dipping the hems of his clothes at Central St. Martin's in latex because he did not want to hem them. So while they were working on the Taxi Driver collection, Lee gave Simon a lace jersey dress to hem, and Simon instead dipped it in latex, which Lee loved. So hence why a lot of the early collections involved latex. And then there was this Elizabethan collar with a leather bustier and feathers that went vertically up the neck that is being worn by Alice Smith, as well as a plastic wrap-coated dress that had feathers throughout it. Simon Unglis actually recreated this. That's the only reason I know it exists. Now, the attention to detail was said to be impeccable. The sleeves and collars of the jackets and shirts were constructed using simple origami principles, a seam at the elbow and lining the fabric under the arms so that the sleeves fit tight to the arms while still allowing for movement. However, the most iconic creation from Taxi Driver was a revolutionary pair of drop waist pants that came to be called bumpsters, which Lee decided to call builder's pants because the low-cut trousers only had a 3-inch rise that quite literally showed the butt. One critic wrote the pants created a cleavage closer to the building site than the boudoir. But I am going to discuss these pants in the next collection because, like I said, none of these clothes exist. And I've done my hardest to find any and all I can, but I have nothing. So, and this wouldn't be the first time Lee's work was thrown out or lost. Sometimes Lee would leave racks of clothes at Alice and Cressida's office, and because they didn't have space, they would beg him to come and pick them up, or they would have to throw them away. And they often did just end up having to throw them away because Lee would never come by. And that feather collar bustier that we saw Alice Smith wearing in that photo shoot only exists in the magazine because it actually fell apart on the taxi ride home. While in the taxi, Lee and Alice watched the entire collar fall apart. She remembers trying to collect and save the pieces, and Lee told her to leave it behind. It was garbage. So that too is lost forever. But this didn't bother Lee. He didn't care. He didn't care if they fell apart or got thrown out or went missing. What we have to truly remember here is that these early shows weren't actually collections to sell. There was no commercial output. The shows happened, and then he moved on to the next thing.
The idea of the collections were never to produce. The shows were all about publicity and creating a marketing ploy for Alexander McQueen, the designer.
The clothes were impossible to reproduce because they were made out of plastic bags or masking tape. They were show clothes.
Katie England, who would become his friend, his muse, and his creative director, said that keeping up with him could be tough because his brain moved so fast. Lee knew that these collections had to make an impact because he had no money, and that was his biggest concern. He didn't know how he was going to continue making collections without money or sales. And thankfully, Britain's fashion industry was unknowingly about to help him out. In the early 90s, London's fashion scene wasn't attracting enough press. Buyers were completely skipping over London for Paris and Milan, so the British Fashion Council set aside money to sponsor 6 new designers to show their collections at London Fashion Week. Lee immediately applied for this and was accepted, and that gave him some money. But it was mostly the event and the exposure, the chance to show at London Fashion Week, that he hoped would spark some interest from the press, from buyers and suppliers. And that collection was Nihilism, named for its anti-romanticism, a rejection of all religious and moral principles, in the belief that life is meaningless, and there is no purpose other than an impulse to destroy. And it was this collection that earned Lee the nickname L'Enfant Terrible and the hooligan of English fashion. Nihilism took inspiration from Hussein Chalayan's St. Martin's graduation collection, The Tangent Flows, where he made silk dresses, buried them in his yard to decay for a few weeks. Lee loved the idea of decay so much that he decided to rework the idea, draping and cutting white chiffon into beautiful dresses, which he then had Simon Unglis drip red clay on, and they left them to hang in the yard. When they brought the dresses in, these small chips of clay had been embedded into the fabric. Lee also found inspiration from natural disasters like floods, fires, and droughts, and how the idea that these disasters created virginal landscapes for new life to be born. Again, the idea of nature gone wrong and hybridization. So that is why he began experimenting with everything from plastic wrap dripped with wet mud, latex, and everything and anything he could get his hands on. He even made a dress covered in formaldehyde locusts, so when worn, it looked like the wearer was being devoured by locusts. This was the first show where Lee showed his McQueen logo that was actually made by Alice Smith's boyfriend.
He said to me, I really need to get a logo. We asked my boyfriend at the time if he would design it. It was my idea to put the C inside the Q, and but then Dave designed the rest of it. He was fantastic at getting people to do a phenomenal amount of work for him, and we were never ever paid. In fact, we were paying him to work for him. Oh, how amazing is that?
The models were modern punks, bruised and smeared with dirt, and their hair in mohawks and tinged red. Some models were doused in water so their dresses clung to their bodies. They wore cotton dresses splattered with red dye, cling wrap dresses smeared with mud and fake blood. The blood was actually suggestive of the breast amputation of St. Agatha. There were also trousers sliced down the back seam to reveal the butt, and a t-shirt with the McQueen logo printed across the chest with 2 bloody handprints running down the front. Some of the pieces even had this odd grid-like pattern that happened entirely by accident. Simon Unglis was using liquid latex and accidentally kicked the can over a drain cover, and once it dried, they peeled it off, and him and Lee loved the pattern so much they decided to use it on the clothes. This entire time period was so experimental. It felt like Carrie was trapped in a couture house. And this collection is also where Lee would, as many people say, like debuted his bumpsters. But that's just because there's no pictures that exist of the other collection. But they were iconic and revolutionary, so let's talk about them. The bumpsters had a 3-inch rise and therefore showed off the entire top half of your butt. They were created by Lee to accentuate the base of the spine, which he found erotic, and to elongate the torso. They were perfectly crafted and tailored, but audacious. Lee said, you've got to know the rules to break them. That's what I'm here for, to demolish the rules, but to keep the tradition. Now I know Mick Jagger and Jimi Hendrix and pretty much all the men of the 60s and 70s wore very low-rise jeans, but nothing was or is as audacious as these bumpsters. He created something that started a craze, and rarely in fashion does someone create something new. Schiaparelli did it with her culottes, Dior did it with his new look, YSL with his A-line silhouette, and Mary Quant with her miniskirt. Most designers spend their entire lives trying to create something new, and Lee did that with his first official collection. Fashion historian Judith Watt believed the origins of the pants can be traced back to a copy of Juan de Alcega's book, Taylor's Pattern Book, where it mentions how men wore their breeches so low they sat on the hip line. While a close friend of Lee's believes that the pants were a natural evolution of YSL's lace smoking, the tuxedo that brought masculinity into women's fashion. While Alice Smith says that when she asked Lee about the pants, he told her it was done purely to elongate the torso and change the way we look at proportion, because usually you want a longer leg, but I wanted a longer top part. He thought it was a classic and beautiful gay silhouette.
It's just a technical thing where, as a tailor and a cutter, a technician, you're breaking up the portion of the body. By lowering the trousers longer, you're elongating the torso, and in illusion, you're giving a longer vision. I had to elongate the abdomen, and the only way to do that was to bring the waistline down to the possible bare minimum. My focus was on the front of the body, not on the back. And the good old British press loved to make something out of nothing, and it's not like it was gorgeous bum, and it's like, oh, builder's bum, and actually they're not appealing at all, not even to a gay man, I'm afraid. It's just about playing with juxtapositions of sort of like cutting techniques, you know. It's nothing to do with bum cleavage, but that's an added bonus if you've got a nice bum. So tailor's got to move on. I mean, how did we get the single and double-breasted suit? You have to move away from something. You know, as a designer, it's just like anything. If you're a designer for cars, you don't design another Mini when there's already one on the street, or another Volvo because there's already one. So, you know, you just got to, as a designer, you design new things. And that's what I see a designer as. I don't philosophise too much. At the end of the day, they're clothes and they're for wearing. I'm not an artist.
So while the true origins of these inspirations may never be known, the Bumpsters didn't get the recognition they deserved. Not shockingly, honestly. When he showed them, much of the fashion world made fun of them. But the designers who disregarded him and hated him were soon dropping their waistlines, allowing for an entire generation of ultra low-rise jeans to come into fashion. In 1998, Helmut Lang created low-rise painter jeans, and Calvin Klein would follow suit not long after. What they created and what people wore was slightly less risque than Lee's work, but had the same shocking results. And as you will come to see, Lee's work would take time to be noticed and appreciated. This collection did not do what he wanted it to do at all. Marion Hume of the UK Independent wrote a 3-page review titled McQueen's Theatre of Cruelty. She wrote, McQueen, who is 24 and from London's East End, has a view that speaks of battered women, of violent lives, of grinding daily existences offset by wild drug-enhanced nocturnal dives into clubs where the dress code is semi-naked. Many photographers were left so upset by what they saw that they stopped taking photos halfway through the show, writing it off as a worthless horror show.
It was kind of electric. Even if you didn't like it, you couldn't dismiss it. There was a rawness that I think was right for the time, and it made everybody sit on the edge of their seats.
Many called Lee a distasteful misogynist, but that was so far from the truth. Alice Smith tried to defend Lee to the press, telling them that he loved women, strong women, more than he liked any man, because Lee's women weren't vulnerable. They had confidence. They were outsiders who had something different about them.
I think it was a way of exercising his demons, a way of protecting women and himself by creating these strong women who looked like they had armour on. There's armour for his heart as well, you know, so...
The main problem was that the audience didn't know Lee. They didn't know the show stemmed from his trauma or his childhood.
I was very close to my oldest sister, who was badly beaten up by her husband. And when you're 8 years old and you're seeing your sister strangled by her husband, who's now dead, thank God, you know, all you want to do is make women look stronger.
For Lee, nothing was off limits and nothing was taboo. He accepted the brutality of mankind and human nature, and he wanted to empower women. And this collection showed the defining features of what would become Lee's work and legacy. After nihilism fell through, Lee kind of wrote the collection off and moved on. He didn't want to let their criticism stop him, and his next collection in February '94 took a look at his life again. Banshee was all about Irish folklore, a fairy woman who foretells death and can often be seen washing the blood from clothes of men about to die, and who were often heard wailing as their boats sank. Banshee began in total silence, and then a bald and very pregnant model walked onto the stage with the McQueen logo stenciled onto her head, and wearing a black Elizabethan gown, which was said to be inspired by the Arnolfini portrait by Jean van Eyck. The collection married Savile Row tailoring with ready-to-wear. Lee even brought in Julian MacDonald, who specialized in knitwear, to make these sweaters with the transparent panels. There was even a beautiful black coat that sort of like fell apart on stage as the model walked, and Simon Unglis vividly remembers this coat. On the night Lee made that coat, he asked Simon to pour resin all over it. And Simon protested. He was like, this jacket is too gorgeous. I don't want to put resin over it. And Lee was like, just do it. We can always make another coat. It's not a big deal. So he poured resin all over it, and once the coat hardened, it looked like black glass, a beautiful coat with shards of resin hanging from it. There were molded breastplates, sharply tailored suits. He even reprised the bumpsters and created the cunsters. Can I say that word on YouTube? Can I say that word? I mean, I'm not monetized. I'm not afraid to say the word either. Can I say that? Whatever. I don't care for censorship, so I'm gonna do what I want. The cunsters were a pair of pant legs held up on the thighs with taupe tape. The collection was a mini punk riot in its purest form. The few reporters who bothered to show up realized they had witnessed something special, calling the show an eclectic mix of romance offset by aggressive edge, while others like British Vogue didn't believe Lee deserved the attention and hoped and prayed to God that he would disappear. Honestly, much of London and Europe just hoped that Lee would disappear. And Isabella Blow, who hailed from the upper class, really wanted to see Lee succeed. She knew what she had to do. So she took him to all the nice restaurants and events happening and introduced him to the aristocracy and their way of life. She even hired someone to teach him falconry, as she knew Lee had an obsession and fascination with birds, and this obscure hobby would make a great conversation starter with the uppity rich. These hobbies say things like, I have so much time in my day that I can learn things like falconry because I'm rich. But that was the exact opposite of Lee. In fact, he didn't have time in his day to actually learn things like falconry. He was dead broke, living off unemployment, and he was from the East End. He didn't belong in their world. But Isabella Blow did her best to create a more well-rounded man that she hoped the British press would finally embrace. And I know Isabella Blow came from a very great place. Like, her heart was in a really good place when she did this. And I know Lee was grateful to her. But he hated this. He hated that he had to change himself. And it was around this time that he began telling friends that he kind of wanted to go to Spain, to a desolate place with no clocks, because he felt like he was losing control of his life. And this will become a common theme throughout the story, so just hold on to it.
I've always had this thing about nature. I get lots of inspiration from nature itself. It comes a lot in my work, really. I mean, it's a big aesthetic for me, so I work on that a lot.
Another common theme of Lee's life and this story is that Lee took inspiration from any and everything, from things he ate, to things he read, to things he saw, to things that people told him. So taking up the practice of falconry is actually what inspired his next collection, The Birds. And it's worth mentioning that it is this collection where Lee was introduced to Katie England, the stylist and fashion director of Dazed and Confused, who would become his right hand and creative director.
That I was in a beach shop called Els and Farrier, and he was also there, and he just said, oh, are you Katie England? And I said, yeah. He said, oh, should we go for a cup of tea? I'd like you to style my show. He just said, oh, you know, we can do it. We'll just have a go. So that was it. I said yes.
The Birds was iconic. It was inspired by Alfred Hitchcock's 1963 film The Birds, which was based on birds going crazy and fighting back against humans and their reckless disregard for nature. Lee wanted his show to focus on the chaos and human vulnerability in the face of nature gone wrong. Now for this show, Lee and Simon Unglis raided the fabric closets at St. Martin's, where Simon Unglis was working, and they used those fabrics in this collection. And I guarantee you Louise Wilson did not know that. Now once all of the clothes were made, Simon Unglis printed tire tracks across the seams to give them a sort of run-over kind of look, saying, I thought birds, road, car, tire, splat. Katie England said 30 minutes before the show, Lee decided that he wanted some of the models to have tire prints on their bodies to make it look like they too had been run over. So Katie England took the tire off her assistant's car, covered it in dirt, and rolled it over the models' bodies. And that is why you kind of see like little peaks of tire tracks throughout. The Birds opened with an alarm blaring in the darkness as a bright light shot out of the tunnel. The first model walked out in a long tailored Victorian-style jacket, and the back had a 2-inch plastic square filled with a lock of hair. When Lee first started out, the hair was actually his own, and by this time and later on, he met a stylist, like a hairstylist, who would give him hair from her clients. So it's just like random strangers' hair in these little plastic pieces. Anyway, there was also a shift dress that looked like it had been made out of a shower curtain, a la Psycho. There was a tailored orange pantsuit with flying black swallows, a nod to sailors who would tattoo swallows on themselves to symbolize they had sailed over 5,000 nautical miles. Swallows also symbolized courage and endurance. And then the iconic Mr. Pearl came out in a custom swallows corset, and it was the first time Lee had a man on the runway dressed in women's clothing. A truly odd sight for the times, but a sign of the times to come. Another sign that nothing was taboo for Lee. Nothing was off limits. The audience loved the show, and Lee was completely shocked because he never realized how revolutionary his clothes could be. Critics said the jackets were nothing short of perfection, and his shows could actually help resuscitate London's dying fashion reputation. The Birds was an absolute turning point. It crowned Lee a rising star to watch, with Simon Unglis saying it was this collection where everything felt like they were going somewhere. There was a clear voice. It was more than just fun. And he was right. This was a job now, a solidified career. And that scared everyone, including Lee. He was telling interviewers, all I have in my head now is the day of the show, and it's doing my head in. It's getting to the point where I'm not doing it because I enjoy it, but because it's what's expected. I've got a feeling I could lose grip altogether. And he was right. Though his career was picking up, Lee was still down bad. He had to borrow 20 pounds for a cab just to get to that show. And after the show, he celebrated by going to Burger King and ordering fries and a Coke because that's all he could afford.
The show was brilliant, but I wake up tomorrow morning and think, I've got to get a bottle of milk. Where am I going to get 42p for?
So we went to a McDonald's. We got 2 cheeseburgers, 2 fries, 2 Cokes. And I was that tired that I just dropped the tray. And then we were having to pick the food up off the floor. And I thought, this is a weird world that you've just shown the finale of London Fashion Week, but we haven't got £5 to eat.
That's how it is. People got to understand that. You know, you do fucking fab shows, but you've got to start living.
Thankfully, though, it was the Birds where Lee met Io Bocchi, an Italian fashion agent, and Lee signed a deal with him to license the McQueen name for a few years, thus giving Lee money to put into his shows, giving them a sharper image and bankability. And the pressure was definitely on him, in other ways as well. After the Birds, the British Fashion Council decided to invite him to show in a larger tent for a bigger audience, and they even offered him funding, giving him £10,000 to create the show, with the only requirement being that he had to create a put smoking out of fashion design for a campaign they were running. There was a lot riding on this show, and Lee felt like this was the last collection where he could go full on and do what he wanted to do. So he looked inward to what was familiar to him and made a collection about his Scottish heritage. Immensely proud of where he came from, Lee knew all about the Scottish upheavals and the clearances of the 18th and 19th centuries when English farmers forced the Highland population to the coastal regions to make space for sheep farms and other agricultural projects owned and run by English aristocrats. The murderous rampages that plagued the Highlands are often described as an ethnic cleansing, but Lee saw it as England's rape of Scotland, and that is how Highland rape was born. The use of the word rape was used to describe the genocide, the rape of Scottish culture by the English, and Lee refused to be apologetic, saying, "A man takes from a woman."
You have 2 types of Scotland people associate themselves with. You have the Vivienne Westwood romantic Scotland, sways of tartan silk. My ancestry is the Jacobites of Scotland, the Bonnie Prince Charlie, but the more raw is the war of the English and the Scottish. But tonight I told it like the way it was, where the English raped loads of women, killed clans completely off. And it's like a form of genocide. It was then, and people don't realise this. They see a Bonnie Prince Charlie and it's very romantic and swashbuckling, but it was actually very gruesome. And rape is very gruesome. But the idea was that saying to the public, you can have it, but I'm not giving it. You can take it rather, but I'm not give it to you. You got to take it. That's what rape is. A man takes from a woman, the woman's not giving it. And so it's like, it's a very strong, I don't beat around the bush when I do a show. I go straight for the jugular.
He said the show was anti-Vivienne Westwood, mostly because of her soft and fake use of tartan, saying 18th century Scotland was not about beautiful women drifting across the moors in swaths of unmanageable chiffon. Vivienne Westwood would respond to this, calling Lee a measure of zero talent, which is funny because if you watch my Vivienne Westwood series, around this time, she was still being shunned by the industry herself. And she had been doing this 20 years by this point, and they still couldn't recognize her talents for anything. And it's also funny because Lee had more formal and technical training than Vivienne Westwood ever had, and he is often regarded, even in her lifetime, as one of the greatest couturiers of our generation. And Lee was right. Clan tartan didn't formally exist until the 19th century, as it became a symbol of rebellion because wearing plaid was illegal under British rule. Highland Rape dealt with Lee's own personal feelings, his own internal battles, standing up against an industry that shunned him. At one point, Lee was so desperate for money and a job that he approached Central St. Martin's to teach a course, but they turned him down, and he didn't understand why. St. Martin's students were sneaking into his shows and pushing out fashion editors in the process, and he was getting turned down for a job where he could teach them, teach people that wanted to learn from him. He was still working in a dismal, low-ceiling basement flat, and he could barely afford to live. He was pissed off, and that showed up on the runway as well. The catwalk was covered in dried thistle, heather, leaves, and moss, and the model's hair was a tangled mess as if they had been running through the forest. And while everyone was running around backstage, one of Lee's assistants remembered the anti-smoking campaign and how they needed to make an outfit for the show so that they could keep their money, and they hadn't. So Lee very quickly took a pair of latex hot pants, smeared glue on them, and dumped an entire ashtray full of cigarettes onto them, and paired it with a lilac blouse that he then burned cigarette holes into. Now, if you ever look at this collection and you see that outfit and you're like, what point did that have? It didn't have any. He needed money. The other models wore tartan and lace dresses ripped at the chest to show their breasts, tailored scoop jackets, dresses with draped sheer black chiffon or torn lace at the chest. Lee asked Sean Lean to make silver chains that he initially thought were going to be put on jackets, but Lee instead placed on the crotch of skirts and pants.
First show I worked on was the Highland Rape, and that was really interesting because obviously it was Lee had seen me make, he'd worked with lots of Victorian restoration pieces of that, so he wanted me to make fob watch chains as an accessory for the clothes. And what I loved about Lee was at that time, this was the first time I'd ever worked with him. I thought he's going to drape them from pocket to chain like the Victorians did. I never worked with a fashion designer before. I didn't have the perception of what he was going to do with these chains, but he didn't. He draped these chains between skirts, and he draped them, I think, from through the back of the skirt, going through the skirt to come out and hang down the front of it. I love the way he did that. He took something old and he made it new and put it somewhere different.
Yeah.
And that was the beginning. And then working with him, then that's how I started to think.
And another fun fact about the show is in an issue of Dazed and Confused, Katie England said the McQueen team really worked to make things out of nothing. They didn't have money or enough clothes, and so for that show in particular, Katie England had to go to an army surplus store and buy trousers to fill in the gaps, which they I guess dressed up. But I never knew this and I thought it was really cool, so maybe while you're watching this you can try and spot them. But the cornerstone piece of the collection was the McQueen clan tartan, a rich red and black check with a thin sunshine yellow line throughout. Using the McQueen clan tartan, Lee constructed complicated dresses based on traditional Scottish attire. And I say complicated because Lee made sure the plaid of every cut piece of fabric matched up when sewed together. And he did this so effortlessly that he rarely made any mistakes or lost fabric in the process. And that is why Isabella Blow always said Lee could cut like a god, because it's such a small detail that really shows how much he cared and how much effort and time he put into every piece he made. The show had a sense of anarchy and chaos to it. The torn, tattered, stained, and dirty garments on the models reflected his ancestral past. But it's obvious to see why the critics were so hard-pressed about the show, accusing him of misogyny and using rape and violence as a form of entertainment.
They're not easy garments to look at. They do look like something from a crime scene.
Alexander McQueen has always been known as a rebel, but this time many people say he went too far. The theme of his show was Highland rape, and he sent his models staggering down the catwalk in torn clothes with breasts exposed, looking like they'd just been violated. The effect was intensified by the use of white contact lenses, which gave the models a glassy and frightened expression.
Most of the press condemned the show. The Times spoke of ugly scenes of sex and violence, and The Independent said it was an insult to women as well as to Alexander's own talent.
But this time, Lee tried to explain himself, to explain his inspirations and the symbolism. He was proud of that collection. It meant a lot to him, and it upset him how the press viewed the show.
I'm not misogynist, but the idea was saying to the public, a man takes from a woman, the woman's not giving it, and that's what rape is.
My oldest sister was badly beaten up by her husband, and when you're 8 years old and you're seeing your sister strangled by her husband, who's now dead, thank God, you know, all you want to do is make women look stronger. No, they can't be further away from the truth. If people do say I portray women like that, it's because I want to portray the way society still sees women in some ways, not the way I see women. You know, my sisters are very strong now. They're very all independent women, and you know, I love them dearly. I'm never, you know, that really pissed me off actually, being called misogynist, because you know I'm an auntie.
He felt like there was no point. The English press had already made up their minds about him, and they weren't going to listen.
I found some of the clothes a little bit misogynistic. I thought he had a misogynistic streak. I thought some of the things that he made those models wear were kind of rather horrible.
I get a bit annoyed when I read that. He was far from a bad boy. In fact, he was a very loving, happy child and very generous.
Despite glowing reviews, London's fashion establishment kept Lee at arm's length. He was an outsider, and it had nothing to do with his work, but his social class. The rest of the world loved Alexander McQueen because they didn't care about his roots, his social class, his rough talk, or his bad manners. All they cared about was his work. While the UK followed a strict class system, being from the East End meant something to them. He was from a working class family. He maintained his Cockney accent that was riddled with profanities. His hair was shaved into a mohawk. He had tattoos and wore ratty clothing and had horrible teeth. Remember what Plum Sykes said about him when she first met him? That's how the British press felt. They tore him apart, calling him an elephant because of his weight and making fun of his appearance on numerous occasions. He told the press, "London gives me fuck all."
I really worked that East End job, this juxtaposition between an hooligan and someone who uses a needle, and people couldn't fathom it. And so it was new, it was a breath of fresh air. I was brought up around here. This is where I come from. It just seems honest, an honest place. You know where you stand. If someone's going to mug you, they tell you before they do it.
And Katie England said, "You have to remember, people didn't really like him. They were shocked. I think it took people a long time to come round to him and understand his talent. People have forgotten that now. They've romanticized it. But if you go back to those days, they didn't really know what to expect, that he would be aggressive or you would feel awkward."
Aesthetically challenged mind, you know, there's always a statement behind it, and you think, but like I said before, my clothes don't come with a notepad on why this jacket looks like it does. At the end of the day, it's a jacket, but the show has got meaning behind it.
Highland Rape was a fairly extraordinary experience because it's the first time I felt, looking back, that Lee really put himself into the show. There seemed to be an element of violence in it, violence or anger, I'm not quite sure what it was, but certainly something deep from his soul.
In my opinion, it almost feels like at this point in time, Lee began using Alexander as armor. He was in completely new territory, a newfound fame filled with critics who focused all their attention on making fun of him. And it made him nervous and it made him sad. His then boyfriend Andrew Grove said, "By this point, Lee was paranoid people were going to betray him or hurt him, and this paranoia was only amplified by Lee's use of drugs, which he began taking around the time of his Banshee show." Lee was under immense pressure. He was also painstakingly shy and sensitive. He took every criticism to heart because he didn't believe in himself or his talents.
Oh, did it piss you off? Well, it should have done. That was the idea.
But Alexander was talented. He had a rough exterior and he didn't care about the critics. Alexander could shine while Lee could turn inward. Only close friends and family saw this shy and sensitive side of Lee. The side of him that loved being in nature with his dogs.
This is my pooch.
And who, as his mother said, had a laugh similar to that of Jack Nicholson.
He's got the most wicked laugh, and every time he laughs over the phone, I think of one person, Jack Nicholson. I can see he reminds me of Jack Nicholson every time he laughs.
The prankster, the mischievous little boy who was scared to be seen and loved for it. Most of the world knew Alexander, the soon-to-be shining star of London fashion. And for now, that was just fine with him. Alexander McQueen could take center stage. He could take control. Even though Lee's life was slowly falling apart. That is something you will come to see, is that there was never truly a moment in his life from here on where it feels like he had it all together. It feels almost like he was always just trying to keep his head above water. But that is something that we will have to save for part 2. I think this is a perfect place to end part 1 because there's still so much left to talk about. And I'm trying to break it up into moments. As of right now, I'm thinking maybe 4 videos. I don't know exactly how much I have left in terms of information, but I am planning on talking about Sarah Burton and Sean McGurr too, so I think it'll maybe be 4 or 5. But I don't know yet. What I can tell you is that I'm already working on part 2, so hopefully you won't have to wait too long for that, I promise. However, these videos only move as fast as I do, and I'm riddled with ADHD, so I don't know. Anyway, on that note, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you maybe loved it. I don't know. Is it too soon to say to each other that you loved it? Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know what you think of this video. I love when y'all reach out. But with that, I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day or night, and thank you for watching. It really means so much to me. Maybe subscribe so you don't miss out. Or don't. There's literally no pressure. I don't monetize the videos anyways. I only say that because I'm going to be making more videos in this series, so if you loved it, it would be easier for you to follow me that way because I don't have a schedule set up. I don't post every 3rd Thursday of the month or the 7th, of every 3rd week. I don't know. I don't know what I'm trying to say. It's just I don't have a schedule. I only post the videos when I finish them, so it'd be easier. But you don't have to. Oh my God, you don't have to. The tangent has to stop. Okay. I will see you all for part 2, hopefully. Okay? I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day. I'm Lollie. I really hope to see you again. Bye.
There's lots of people in the industry who say, I discovered Alexander McQueen. But you don't discover talent. Talent's there. You open doors for talent, you push it through, or you help it along. No one discovered Alexander McQueen. Alexander McQueen discovered himself.